That thing belongs in a museum, not on a firing line. That's what a 26-year-old competitive shooter said when he saw the rifle. A scratched, worn, 60-year-old M1 Carbine with a stock that looked like it had been dragged across 3 continents. The old man carrying it didn't respond. He just set his range bag down on the bench, adjusted his ball cap, and started loading 15-round magazines with hands that moved like they'd done this 10,000 times before. Nobody on that firing line knew what was about to happen. Nobody knew that in less than 4 minutes, every single one of them would be standing in silence, watching a man they'd laughed at rewrite everything they thought they knew about speed, precision, and what it really means to know your weapon. If this story hits you where it matters, type respect in the comments right now, and stay with me, because this one's going to stay with you. The Millbrook Regional Carbine Challenge was one of those events that had grown quietly over the past 5 years from a small local fun shoot into something approaching a legitimate regional competition. Held every spring at the Millbrook Valley Sportsman's Club in rural Pennsylvania, the match attracted shooters from across 3 states. The format was practical carbine, meaning timed stages that tested accuracy, speed, transitions between targets, and reloads under the clock. There were steel poppers at 25 yards, paper silhouettes at 50, and a barricade stage that required shooting from awkward positions while managing magazine changes. The entry fee was modest. The prizes were gift cards and bragging rights, and the atmosphere on any given match day was a mix of genuine competitive intensity and weekend warrior camaraderie. Most of the shooters who showed up drove trucks with tactical stickers on the rear windows, wore plate carriers over moisture-wicking shirts, and carried rifles that cost more than some people's monthly rent. Custom-built AR-15 platforms with free-floated barrels, adjustable gas blocks, Geissler triggers, Aimpoint or EOTech optics, ambidextrous charging handles, and 30-round Magpul magazines loaded with match-grade ammunition. These were serious tools built for serious speed, and the men and women who carried them trained regularly, watched instructional content, attended courses, and spent considerable money dialing in their setups. This was their world. And on the morning of May 11th, every one of them was about to meet a man who didn't belong in it. Or so they thought. His name was Arthur Dillard. He was 74 years old. He stood about 5'9", maybe 160 soaking wet, with a frame that had once been wiry and strong, but had long since surrendered to the quiet erosion of decades. His face was weathered in the way that faces get when they've spent more time outdoors than in, with deep lines around his eyes and a jaw that still held a certain firmness, even though the skin around it had gone slack. He wore khaki trousers, a faded green canvas jacket that might have been army surplus from the late 70s, and a ball cap that said nothing on it at all. No brand, no flag, no clever phrase, just a plain dark blue cap, slightly bent at the brim, that looked like it had been with him for years. He carried a canvas rifle bag that was so old the stitching had been resewn in 3 places, and when he unzipped it on the staging bench, the rifle inside drew looks from every direction. It was an M1 Carbine, not a reproduction, not a commercial remake from Auto Ordnance or Inland Manufacturing's Revival line. This was an original. A genuine World War II-era Inland Division, General Motors M1 Carbine, with a serial number that placed its manufacture somewhere around late 1943. The stock was dark walnut that had been worn smooth in places and nicked deeply in others. The barrel band was slightly tarnished. The rear sight was the original adjustable flip type, not upgraded, not replaced. The finish on the receiver had worn to a mottled grey in the places where hands and slings and holsters had rubbed it for decades. It looked, to the casual observer, like a relic, a piece of history, something you'd see under glass at a VFW hall with a small brass plaque beneath it. It did not look like something you'd bring to a timed carbine competition against rifles that represented the cutting edge of modern firearms engineering. Arthur set the carbine on the bench with the action open, muzzle pointed downrange, and began pulling 15-round magazines from his bag. He had 6 of them. They were old too, original military-issue magazines with the bodies showing wear and the followers still functioning cleanly, because he maintained them with the kind of religious discipline that only certain men of a certain era understood. He loaded them methodically, pressing each round of .30 carbine ammunition down with his thumb, stacking them with a rhythm that never varied. Press, click, press, click, press, click. His hands were spotted with age and the knuckles were slightly swollen, but his fingers moved with a precision that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with repetition measured not in hundreds, but in tens of thousands of iterations across a lifetime. The first person to say something was a younger shooter named Kyle Tanner. Kyle was 26, built like a CrossFit enthusiast, and carried a custom Daniel Defense DDM 4V7 with a Vortex Razor Red dot, a Surefire suppressor-ready muzzle brake, and a Geisel SSAE trigger that broke like a glass rod at exactly 3.5 pounds. Kyle had been shooting competitively for 4 years and had finished in the top 5 at Millbrook the previous 2 seasons. He was good, he knew he was good, and he had the kind of confidence that comes from being good at something visible while still being young enough to believe that being good at a visible thing was the same as understanding something deeply. Kyle walked past Arthur's bench, glanced at the M1 Carbine, and stopped. He didn't even try to hide his amusement. "Hey, is that thing semi-auto, or do you have to pull the bolt back each time?" he asked, and 2 of his friends standing nearby laughed. Arthur looked up briefly. "It's semi-automatic," he said, his voice low and even. "Cycles off a short-stroke piston." Kyle nodded with an exaggerated expression of mock surprise. "Okay, cool. Well, good luck out there, sir. You might want to stay behind the barricade, though. Some of these stages get a little fast." More laughter. Arthur said nothing. He went back to loading his magazines. A few benches down, another competitor named Derek Michaels had watched the exchange. Derek was in his early 30s, a former Marine who'd done 2 deployments and now worked as a firearms instructor. He carried a BCM Recce 16 with a primary arms optic and ran his stages with the kind of efficiency that comes from actual time behind a rifle in environments where the clock wasn't a buzzer, but was instead the difference between living and not. Derek didn't laugh at Arthur's rifle. He didn't say anything at all, but he watched. He watched Arthur's hands. He watched the way the old man loaded his magazines without looking down, the way he performed a function check on the carbine with a series of small, deliberate movements that were clearly habitual, clearly ingrained beyond conscious thought. Derek had seen hands like that before. He'd seen them on master sergeants and senior NCOs who'd been handling weapons since before he was born. Hands that didn't think about what they were doing because thinking was something you did the first 500 times. After that, it was just physics. Derek said nothing, but he kept watching. The match director that morning was a man named Paul Kreider. Paul was 53, a retired state trooper who'd been running the Millbrook match since its 2nd year. He was organised, fair, safety-conscious to the point of rigidity, and quietly passionate about the shooting sports in a way that made him an excellent steward of the event. He walked the line before the first stage, clipboard in hand, checking that all competitors had signed waivers, confirmed their equipment and understood the stage briefing. When he reached Arthur's bench, he paused. He looked at the M1 Carbine. He looked at Arthur. "Sir, you're running that in the match today?" he asked, not unkindly. Arthur nodded. "I am." Paul hesitated. "You know this is a timed carbine course. Multiple stages, reloads under the clock, transitions. It's not a bullseye match." Arthur met his eyes. There was something in that look that Paul couldn't quite identify. Not hostility, not defiance. Something quieter, something settled. "I understand the format," Arthur said. "I read the stage descriptions on the website. I've been shooting carbine matches longer than the website's been up." Paul looked at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, you're in Squad 3. You'll be on deck for Stage 1 in about 20 minutes. Arthur nodded once and Paul moved on, but something about the exchange stuck with him. Something about the way the old man had said it. Not boastful, not defensive, just factual. The way a man states something he has no need to prove because the proving was done long before anyone asked. Stage 1 was called Rapid Engagement. 5 steel poppers at 25 yards, all in a line, all requiring centre hits to go down. The shooter started at a low ready position and on the buzzer engaged all 5 targets as fast as possible. Simple. Brutal. A test of pure speed and accuracy at close to moderate range. The competitive shooters ran it efficiently. Kyle Tanner knocked all 5 down in 4.2 seconds, which earned a low whistle from a few onlookers. His splits, the time between each shot, were hovering around 0.6 seconds, which was genuinely fast for a practical match. Another shooter, a man in his 40s named Greg Hollis, who shot for a local team, ran it in 4.5. Derek Michaels posted a 4.1, the fastest of the morning so far, with controlled aggression that showed his background. The scores were clustering in the 4 to 5 second range, with a few outliers pushing up towards 6 or 7 from less experienced shooters. Then Arthur stepped to the line. He moved deliberately but not slowly. There was no wasted motion. He positioned himself behind the firing line, settled his feet shoulder-width apart in a stance that looked like it had been carved into his body by some ancient and unforgiving instructor, and brought the M1 Carbine up to a low ready. The range officer looked at him, looked at the rifle, and called the commands. "Shooter ready?" Arthur nodded once, his eyes already fixed downrange, his breathing already controlled. "Stand by." The buzzer sounded. What happened next would become the most talked-about moment in the history of the Millbrook Regional Carbine Challenge. The M1 Carbine came up. The first shot broke before the rifle had even fully settled into his shoulder pocket, which to anyone watching looked like he fired while still mounting the weapon. The first steel popper went down, then the second, then the third. The sound of the shots was different from the AR-15S. Not the sharp, controlled crack of a 5.56 round through a muzzle brake, but a deeper, rounder bark that echoed off the hillside behind the range like something from another century. Which, in a sense, it was. The fourth popper went down. The fifth popper went down. The timer beeped. The range officer looked at his handheld display, blinked and looked again. 3.8 seconds, 5 shots, 5 hits, all down, no misses. The firing line went quiet. Not the gradual quiet of people losing interest, but the sudden quiet of people who have just seen something that doesn't fit their understanding of how the world works. Kyle Tanner, who was standing behind the line waiting to help reset targets, had his mouth slightly open. Greg Hollis was staring at the old man's rifle like it had just performed a magic trick. Derek Michaels, standing off to the side with his arms crossed, allowed himself a small, knowing nod. He wasn't surprised. He'd been watching. He'd known. Paul Crader, the match director, looked down at his clipboard, wrote the time, and underlined it twice. Arthur cleared his carbine, showed the empty chamber to the range officer, and walked back to the staging area without a word. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the scoreboard. He sat down at his bench, set the carbine across his knees, and took a drink of water from a metal canteen that looked as old as the rifle. A man sitting 2 benches over, an older shooter in his 50s named Ray, leaned toward him. "That was something," Ray said. Arthur glanced at him. "That was stage 1, he replied, and went back to his water. Stage 2 was called transition drill. It required the shooter to engage 3 paper silhouette targets at 50 yards, each requiring 2 hits in the center scoring zone, then transition to a set of 3 steel plates at 30 yards on the opposite side of the shooting bay, requiring 1 hit each. Total of 9 rounds minimum, with a mandatory magazine change somewhere in the sequence, since most shooters loaded their first magazine with 6 rounds to force a reload between the paper and steel arrays. This was the stage that separated the weekend plinkers from the serious competitors. It required accuracy at distance, the fine motor skill of a speed reload under the time pressure, and the ability to transition smoothly between target arrays without losing the sight picture. The AR-15 shooters had a significant advantage here. 30-round magazines meant they could load their first mag with the full 9 rounds and skip the reload entirely, or load 6 and do a fast bolt-hold-open reload with a fresh 30-round magazine, slapping it home and releasing the bolt catch in a motion so practiced it took less than a second. The M1 Carbine, with its 15-round magazines and different manual of arms, would require Arthur to manage his ammunition differently. The magazine release was in a different position. The bolt-hold-open worked differently. The ergonomics of the reload were rooted in 1940s infantry doctrine, not 21st century competition technique. Or so everyone assumed. Kyle Tanner ran stage 2 in 7.9 seconds. Clean. No misses. His reload was slick, a sub-1 second emergency reload that he'd practiced thousands of times in his garage, with a shot timer and a stack of empty magazines. Greg Hollis posted an 8.3. Derek Michaels ran it in 7.4, the fastest again. His transition sharp and his reload barely perceptible to the naked eye. The top shooters were all clustered in the 7 to 9 second range. When Arthur stepped to the line for stage 2, the atmosphere had shifted. After his performance on stage 1, the mockery had been replaced by something else. Curiosity, skepticism still, but the kind of skepticism that has a crack in it. The kind that's already starting to let doubt seep through. People were watching now, not glancing, watching. Phones had come out. Someone in the back of the crowd had started recording. Arthur loaded his first magazine with 6 rounds of .30 carbine. He seated it into the carbine with a firm push and a tug to confirm it was locked. He placed his second magazine, fully loaded with 15 rounds, in a canvas pouch on his left hip that looked like it might have been actual military issue from a war that most of the people on this range only knew from movies. He stepped to the line. The range officer called him ready. The buzzer sounded. The first 2 shots hit the first paper silhouette before most people had processed that the stage had started. Arthur's eyes moved to the second silhouette and 2 more rounds punched through the centre mass scoring ring. He shifted to the third silhouette. 2 more hits, 6 rounds expended, the bolt locked back on the empty magazine. And then something happened that made Derek Michaels actually uncross his arms and take a step forward. Arthur's left hand dropped to the canvas pouch on his hip, drew the fresh magazine, and in a single fluid motion that was neither rushed nor slow but existed in some other category entirely, a category that could only be described as the absolute absence of unnecessary movement, he pressed the magazine release with his right hand, stripped the empty magazine free, seated the fresh magazine and released the bolt. The carbine was back in battery, and his first round hit the first steel plate before most of the onlookers had fully registered that he'd completed a reload. It was fast. Not competition trick fast. Not YouTube video fast. It was something else. It was institutional. It was the product of a system of weapons handling that had been designed not for competition, but for survival, drilled into men who needed to reload not to shave tenths of a second off a score but to stay alive when the other side was shooting back. And it was, by any objective measure, devastatingly effective. The second steel plate went down. The third steel plate went down. The timer beeped. 6.9 seconds, 9 rounds, 9 hits, no misses. A full second faster than Derek Michaels, who was the best pure shooter on the range that day, and who was now staring at Arthur Dillard with an expression that combined professional respect with something approaching disbelief. The reload alone had taken approximately 1.1 seconds, which, with a 60-year-old M1 Carbine and original military magazines and a canvas belt pouch, was nothing short of extraordinary. Paul Crader wrote the time on his clipboard. He underlined it 3 times. The murmuring started immediately. It rippled through the crowd of 40 or so spectators and competitors like a stone dropped in still water. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? How is he doing that with that rifle? Is that thing even legal for the match? Of course it was legal. Semi-automatic, centerfire rifle, iron sights or optics permitted, no minimum caliber specified. The M1 Carbine met every requirement. It just didn't meet anyone's expectations. Kyle Tanner, to his credit, had stopped talking. He was standing near the scoring table with his arms at his sides, watching the old man walk back to his bench with the same unhurried, economical stride he'd used to walk to the line. Kyle's expression was difficult to read. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't embarrassment quite. It was the particular look of a young man who's just been forced to confront the possibility that expertise and equipment are not the same thing. That speed is not just a function of trigger pull weight and split times, but of something deeper, something that lives in the neurology of a person who has done a thing so many times that the doing has become indistinguishable from breathing. Stage 3 was the Barricade stage. It was called covered position, and it was the most technically demanding stage of the match. The shooter started standing behind a wooden barricade with a window-sized port cut into it. On the buzzer, they engaged 2 steel targets through the port from the right side, then transitioned to the left side of the barricade and engaged 2 more targets. Then they dropped to a kneeling position and engaged a final target through a low port at the base of the barricade. 5 targets total, all steel, all at ranges between 15 and 40 yards. The stage tested positional shooting, the ability to maneuver a rifle around a barricade efficiently, and the physical ability to transition from standing to kneeling quickly. For the younger, more athletic shooters, the kneeling transition was easy. For a 74-year-old man with decades of wear on his knees and hips, it should have been a significant disadvantage. The competitive shooters ran the barricade stage with varying degrees of efficiency. Kyle Tanner posted a 6.1, Derek Michaels, smooth as always, ran it in 5.6. Several shooters had misses on the transition shots, where the change from right side to left side shooting forced them to adjust their cheek weld and sight picture under time pressure. The AR-15 platform, with its pistol grip and adjustable stock, made these transitions relatively intuitive. The M1 Carbine, with its traditional rifle stock and different ergonomic profile, would theoretically make them harder. When Arthur stepped to the line for Stage 3, the crowd had grown. Word had spread among the spectators, the way it always does at shooting events when someone is doing something unusual. People had wandered over from the pistol bays and the long-range rifle range. A couple of the range safety officers who weren't on duty had come to watch. The man with the phone was still recording, and he'd been joined by 2 others. Arthur approached the barricade. He looked at it the way a carpenter looks at a piece of wood he's about to cut, assessing angles and possibilities with a practiced eye. He positioned himself on the right side, brought the carbine up, and waited. The buzzer sounded. The first 2 shots through the right side port were so fast and so close together that they sounded almost like a single report. Both steel targets went down. Arthur moved laterally to the left side of the barricade. His footwork was precise, not fast in the way that young men are fast with explosive athletic movement, but fast in the way that water flows around a stone, with no energy wasted on anything that doesn't serve the objective. He cleared the left edge of the barricade, acquired the 2 left side targets, and put them down with 2 shots that were, if anything, even more precisely timed than the first pair. Then he dropped to kneeling, and this was the moment that would define the narrative of that morning. Because 74-year-old men do not, as a rule, drop to kneeling positions quickly. Their knees protest, their balance wavers, their bodies remind them of every year and every hard surface and every bad landing that has accumulated in their joints over the course of a long life. Arthur went down like he'd been doing it every day since 1968, which, as it would turn out, was not far from the truth. His left knee hit the ground, his right knee came up to support his elbow, and the carbine was already aligned on the low port target before his body had fully settled into the position. The 5th shot rang out. The 5th steel target went down. The timer beeped. 5.1 seconds, 5 shots, 5 hits. There was a moment of absolute silence that lasted perhaps 2 full seconds, which at a shooting competition is an eternity. Then someone in the back of the crowd started clapping. 1 person, then 2, then a dozen. Then the entire gallery of onlookers was applauding, and a few were whooping, and Kyle Tanner was standing there watching Arthur Dillard rise from the kneeling position, with the careful, slightly stiff movement of a man whose body has earned every one of its limitations, and Kyle's expression had completed its journey from mockery to confusion to something that looked very much like the beginning of humility. Derek Michaels walked forward and extended his hand to Arthur as the old man stepped off the line. Arthur looked at the offered hand, then at Derek's face, and shook it. "Marine?" Arthur asked. Derek nodded. 2 tours? Iraq? Arthur studied him for a moment. "You shoot well," he said. "Smooth, controlled. Your instructor did good work." Derek smiled slightly. "So did yours." Arthur's eyes flickered with something just for an instant, something old and deep and layered with decades. "My instructors did their work under different circumstances," he said quietly, and moved on. Stage 4 was called Speed Plate Rack, a standard plate rack, 6 8-inch steel plates in a line at 15 yards, all 6 to be knocked down as fast as possible. This was pure speed. No transitions, no barricades, no positional shooting, just the ability to put rounds on smallish steel targets as fast as the shooter could manipulate the trigger while maintaining enough accuracy to connect. The AR-15 shooters attacked this stage with everything they had. Sub-3-pound triggers, red dots that put a crisp aiming point exactly where the eye wanted it, muzzle brakes that turned felt recoil into a gentle push, ergonomics designed from the ground up for rapid, controlled fire. Kyle Tanner ran the plate rack in 3.4 seconds and pumped his fist. It was the fastest he'd ever run one in a match. Derek Michaels posted a 3.6. Greg Hollis ran a 3.8. The times were impressive by any standard. These were skilled shooters running a straightforward drill at a high level. Arthur stepped to the line. He held the M1 Carbine in a way that, by now, the crowd had started to recognize as distinctly his own. Not the modern aggressive stance with the support hand extended far forward on a free-floated handguard. Not the squared-up, weight-forward competition posture taught in every tactical carbine class in America. Something older. Something that looked like a fighting stance from an era when the people who taught it had learned what worked by finding out what didn't, under conditions no training course could simulate. His feet were offset. His weight was slightly rearward. The carbine was mounted high and tight to his shoulder, in a way that minimized the distance between the rear sight and his eye. He looked like a photograph from a training manual that nobody used anymore, and when the buzzer sounded, the M1 Carbine spoke 6 times in what the timer would later confirm was 2.9 seconds. 6 plates, 6 shots, 6 hits, all down, clean. The crowd erupted. There was no other word for it. It erupted. People were shouting. People were laughing in that particular way that people laugh when they've witnessed something that defies their expectations so completely that laughter is the only response that makes neurological sense. Kyle Tanner put both hands on top of his head and just stood there, staring downrange at 6 empty plate positions with an expression of pure, unfiltered astonishment. Paul Kreider didn't write the time on his clipboard immediately. He stood there for a moment holding his pen above the paper, and then he looked at Arthur Dillard, and then he looked at the carbine, and then he shook his head very slowly and wrote the number down. He underlined it 4 times, and then he circled it. Between stages 4 and 5 there was a scheduled 15-minute break, water, ammunition resupply, the restroom, and conversation. The conversation was, by that point, entirely about Arthur Dillard. Clusters of shooters stood around the staging area, leaning against truck tailgates and sitting on coolers, and the question on everyone's lips was the same. Who is he? Nobody knew. He hadn't registered for the match under any team affiliation. His entry form, which Paul Kreider discreetly checked, listed his name, his address in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, and nothing else. No club, no military branch, no NRA number. Just Arthur Dillard, 74 years old, shooting an M1 Carbine. Derek Michaels knew more than most, but only from observation. He'd been watching Arthur all morning, not with the gawking curiosity of the crowd, but with the analytical eye of a professional. He'd noticed things that most people had missed. The way Arthur performed a chamber check every single time he picked up the rifle, even when he'd just set it down. The way he kept his finger indexed straight along the receiver when he wasn't actively engaging targets, a habit so deeply ingrained that it was clearly unconscious. The way he moved laterally, his feet never crossing, his centre of gravity always balanced. These weren't competition habits, they were combat habits. Habits that were taught in places where getting them wrong didn't cost you points. It cost you everything. Derek approached Arthur during the break. The old man was sitting on a folding chair behind his bench, eating an apple and looking out across the range with an expression of quiet contentment. "Mind if I ask you something?" Derek said. Arthur looked at him. "You already did earlier, but go ahead." "Where'd you learn to run a carbine like that?" Arthur took another bite of his apple. He chewed slowly. He looked at Derek with eyes that were sharp and clear and utterly unhurried. "Fort Benning initially," he said. 1969, advanced infantry training, then the 7th Infantry Division at Fort Ord, then the 25th Infantry Division, then a few places they didn't put on the letterhead. Derek waited. He knew better than to push. Old soldiers talked when they were ready, and not before. Arthur looked at the M1 Carbine lying across his knees. He ran his thumb along a deep scratch in the stock that looked like it had been there for decades. "This carbine was my father's," he said. "He carried it in the Ardennes, Bastogne, winter of '44. He was with the 101st Airborne 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He jumped into Normandy, but by the bulge they were trucked in. No jump that time, just cold and Germans and not enough of anything. He carried this carbine through all of it. When he came home, he kept it. When he died in 1982, he left it to me." Arthur paused. "I was already career Army by then. Had been since I was 18. Spent 32 years in. Started as a private. Retired as a sergeant major. E9. Saw more places and did more things than I'll ever talk about in detail at a shooting competition." He looked at Derek. "But I'll tell you this. My father taught me to shoot this carbine when I was 12 years old, in a cornfield behind our house in Lancaster County. He taught me to load it, shoot it, clear it, reload it, and maintain it like my life depended on it. And then the United States Army spent 3 decades reinforcing every single thing he taught me, plus about 10,000 things he never got the chance to." Derek was quiet for a long moment. "Sergeant Major," he said, and the way he said it carried the weight of recognition that only one soldier can give another. "Sergeant Major." Arthur looked at him and nodded once with a gravity that acknowledged the title and everything behind it. "You were the fastest man on the range when I got here this morning," Arthur said. "Your fundamentals are outstanding. Your transitions are clean. Your reloads are efficient. You're a credit to whoever trained you." Derek smiled. "Thank you. Sergeant Major, but I think we both know who the fastest man on the range is today." Arthur allowed himself the smallest ghost of a smile. "The rifle knows what it's doing," he said. "I just let it work." The conversation between Arthur and Derek hadn't been private. Several people had been within earshot, and in the way of small communities, the information spread instantly. Sergeant Major, 32 years, career army. Father carried that carbine at Bastogne. The story moved through the crowd like electricity through a conductor, and by the time the break ended and the shooters were called back to the line for Stage 5, the entire atmosphere of the Millbrook Regional Carbine Challenge had fundamentally changed. This was no longer a competition in the conventional sense. It had become something else. It had become a demonstration, a witnessing, an encounter with something that most of the people present had only ever read about or seen in movies, but had never stood 3 feet away from and watched with their own eyes. The real thing. The genuine article. Competence so deep and so thoroughly integrated into a human being's neural pathways that it had become as natural as breathing, as unremarkable to its possessor as blinking, and as stunning to everyone else as watching water run uphill. Stage 5 was called El Presidente, a classic combat shooting drill adapted for carbine. The shooter started facing away from 3 paper silhouette targets at 10 yards. On the buzzer, the shooter turned, drew the rifle to ready, and engaged each target with 2 rounds, performed a mandatory magazine change, and engaged each target with 2 more rounds. 12 rounds total. The drill tested draw speed, target engagement, reload under pressure, and re-engagement accuracy. It was one of the most widely used combat shooting drills in the world, designed originally for pistol but adapted for carbine by competitive shooters decades ago. It rewarded everything that Arthur Dillard apparently was: fast, accurate, smooth on the reload, and utterly unbothered by the clock. Kyle Tanner ran the El Presidente in 8.2 seconds, which was solid. His reload was clean. His splits were consistent. He looked at the targets when he was done and saw 12 holes in the centre mass scoring zone, all within the 8 ring, and he nodded to himself because that was a run he could be proud of. Derek Michaels posted a 7.6, the fastest of the match, to that point on that stage, with hits that were almost disturbingly consistent. A couple of other competitive shooters posted times in the 8 to 9 second range. The M1 Carbine was about to face its most complex challenge yet: a mandatory reload in the middle of a rapid-fire engagement sequence against targets that required a 180-degree turn to initiate. The ergonomics of the traditional rifle stock meant that the turn and mount would be different from the AR platform. The reload would require the same manual of arms that Arthur had already demonstrated, but under the additional cognitive load of a multi-target engagement sequence that demanded spatial awareness and shot accountability. Arthur stepped to the line. He positioned himself with his back to the targets, the carbine held low at his side. His first magazine was loaded with 6 rounds. His reload magazine was in the canvas pouch on his left hip. The range officer called the commands. The buzzer sounded. Arthur turned, not with the explosive rotation of a young athlete, but with a controlled, efficient pivot that brought his body around and the carbine up simultaneously, so that by the time he was facing the targets, the rifle was already in his shoulder, and his eyes were already on the first silhouette. 2 shots, transition, 2 shots, transition, 2 shots, the bolt locked back, the reload, that reload, the one that defied every assumption about what a 74-year-old man with a 60-year-old rifle should be able to do. Magazine out, magazine in, bolt released. The carbine barked 6 more times in a sequence so rhythmic it sounded mechanical. 2, 2, 2, 12 rounds, 12 hits, all center mass. The timer read 6.8 seconds. Paul Kreider didn't underline the time. He didn't circle it. He set his pen down, took off his glasses, cleaned them on his shirt, put them back on, and looked at Arthur Dillard with an expression that combined professional awe with something deeper and harder to name. Paul had been around competitive shooting for decades. He'd seen national-level competitors. He'd seen exhibition shooters. He'd seen active-duty special operations soldiers run drills at speeds that seemed to violate the laws of physics. But he had never, in all his years, seen a 74-year-old retired sergeant major run an El Presidente drill in 6.8 seconds, clean with a World War II M1 Carbine using original magazines from a canvas belt pouch. Because that had probably never happened before. Not here, not anywhere. And yet, there it was. The match continued through 3 more stages, and on every single one, Arthur Dillard either posted the fastest time or came within tenths of a second of it. On the longer-range precision stage, where shooters engaged a reduced-size silhouette at 100 yards from a standing unsupported position, Arthur shot a group that the target officer measured at 3.2 inches, with iron sights, at 100 yards, standing. The .30 carbine round, a cartridge that most modern shooters dismissed as underpowered and inaccurate, had been placed with surgical precision into a cluster that many of the AR-15 shooters with their magnified optics and match-grade barrels couldn't match. On the standard stage, which combined timed strings of fire at multiple distances, Arthur's aggregate time was the fastest of the match, by nearly 2 full seconds. 2 full seconds. In a sport where tenths decided placements, the margin was absurd. It wasn't just that he was good, it was that he existed on a different plane of the discipline. The other shooters were competing. Arthur Dillard was executing. There was a difference, and everyone on that range could feel it, even if they couldn't articulate it. Competition is a game. Execution is what you do when the game is your life. The final stage was complete. The scores were tallied. Arthur Dillard had won the Millbrook Regional Carbine Challenge by the largest margin in the event's history. He had done it with a rifle that was manufactured before the majority of his competitors were born. He had done it with iron sights, while others used red dots and magnified optics. He had done it with a canvas magazine pouch, while others used polymer Keydex speed rigs, and belt-mounted mag carriers designed by engineers specifically for competitive shooting. He had done it with a quiet, unhurried, supremely confident mastery that made every other performance on the range that day look like what it was. Practice. His was not practice. His was the accumulated product of a lifetime spent with a weapon in his hands, and not just any weapon, but this weapon. This specific M1 Carbine that his father had carried through the frozen hell of the Ardennes, and that he himself had carried, maintained, trained with, and shot for over 60 years. He didn't just know the rifle, he was an extension of it, or it was an extension of him. At a certain level of mastery, the distinction ceases to be meaningful. Paul Creeder gathered the competitors and spectators for the award presentation. It was informal, as it always was at Millbrook. Shooters standing around in a semicircle, the match director reading times and placements. But when Paul got to the overall winner, he stopped. He looked at the card, then at Arthur, then at the crowd. "Before I announce the overall results," Paul said, "I want to do something a little unusual. In 5 years of running this match, I've never made a request like this of a competitor, but I don't think we're going to see something like what we saw today again anytime soon, maybe not ever." He turned to Arthur, who was standing slightly apart from the group, his carbine in its canvas bag over his shoulder. "Mr. Dillard, Sergeant Major Dillard, I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to do a demonstration for the entire firing line. Show these folks your technique. Walk them through how you run that carbine, your reload, your transitions, whatever you're willing to share." He paused. "These are good shooters here. They train hard, they spend money, they practice, and I think every single one of them would benefit from watching you work, because what you did today isn't just about speed or talent, it's something else, and I think they deserve to see it up close." The range went quiet. 40 sets of eyes fixed on the old man with the canvas bag. Arthur looked at Paul for a long moment. Then he looked at the crowd. He saw young faces and old faces. He saw expensive rifles and worn ones. He saw Kyle Tanner standing in the front row, looking at him with an expression that had completed its entire arc from mockery through shock to something that was now, unmistakably, open-mouthed respect. He saw Derek Michaels standing off to the side with his arms crossed again, but this time with a slight nod that said, "Do it, Sergeant Major. Show them." Arthur was quiet for several seconds. Then he set his bag down, unzipped it, and drew the M1 Carbine out. He held it in front of him, not in a shooting position but in a display position, the way a man holds something he loves and respects and has carried through the weight of a long life. "This carbine," Arthur said, and his voice carried across the range with a clarity and authority that belied his age, was manufactured by the Inland Division of General Motors in Dayton, Ohio, in November of 1943. It was issued to my father, Private First Class Robert Dillard, as a replacement weapon in September of 1944, after his M1 Garand was destroyed by a mortar blast near Carentan, He carried it through the Rhineland. He carried it through the Ardennes. He carried it through Bastogne, where the temperature dropped to -20, and men froze to death in their foxholes, and this little carbine kept working because he maintained it every single day, no matter how cold his hands were, no matter how tired he was, no matter what was happening around him. Arthur paused. He looked down at the rifle. He brought it home. He taught me to shoot it when I was a boy, and I've been shooting it for 62 years. I joined the army in 1969, and I spent 32 years learning everything there is to learn about how to employ a weapon under stress. I trained with every rifle the army issued, the M14, the M16, the M4. I qualified expert on all of them, but every weekend, every leave, every chance I got, I came home and I shot this carbine. Because this is the one that taught me. This is the one that connects me to my father, and this is the one that reminds me, every time I pick it up, that a weapon is only as good as the hands that hold it and the discipline of the person behind it. He began to demonstrate. He showed them his reload. Slowly, first, breaking it down into its component movements: magazine release, magazine strip, fresh magazine insert, bolt release. 4 distinct movements, each performed with a precision that made the individual steps visible and comprehensible. Then he did it at half speed, then at 3/4 speed, then at full speed, and at full speed it became, once again, a single fluid motion that seemed to defy the number of mechanical steps it actually contained. The crowd watched in silence. Then he showed them his stance. He explained the offset feet, the high rifle mount, the way he used the traditional stock to create a natural point of aim that required minimal muscular effort to maintain. He talked about breathing. He talked about trigger control. He talked about the way the M1 Carbine's trigger, which was heavier and longer than any modern competition trigger, actually taught a shooter discipline because it forced you to press straight through without disturbing the sight picture, a skill that transferred to every other weapon you'd ever touch. He talked about transitions, about the way the eyes should move first, then the body, then the weapon, always in that order, and about how so many young shooters get it backward, swinging the rifle and then trying to find the target, when the target should already be found by the eyes before the rifle starts to move. He talked for 15 minutes, and nobody shifted. Nobody checked their phone. Nobody whispered to the person next to them. 40 shooters and 50 spectators stood in absolute riveted attention, and they listened to a sergeant major teach, because that is what sergeant majors do. They are the keepers of standards, the enforcers of discipline, the institutional memory of the military profession. And even in retirement, even at 74, even on a civilian range in rural Pennsylvania surrounded by people who had never served, the authority was undeniable. It filled the space, it commanded the silence, it earned the respect. When Arthur finished his demonstration, Kyle Tanner did something that nobody expected. He walked forward. He stood in front of Arthur Dillard, and he extended his hand. "Sir," Kyle said, and his voice was different now, stripped of the bravado and the sarcasm and the casual arrogance that had characterized him earlier that morning. "I owe you an apology. What I said about your rifle was ignorant and disrespectful, and I'm sorry." Arthur looked at the young man. He looked at the extended hand, and he took it, not with a crushing grip or a performative display, but with a firm, brief handshake that acknowledged the apology and accepted it without making a production of it. "You've got fast hands," Arthur said, "and you've got a good rifle, but you're chasing speed when you should be building fundamentals. Speed is a byproduct of efficiency. Efficiency is a byproduct of repetition, and repetition only works if you're repeating the right things." He paused. "Slow down, get perfect, then get fast. Don't do it the other way around." Kyle nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered and received. And the exchange between the two men, the young competitor and the old soldier, carried a weight that went beyond the specifics of shooting technique. It was about the relationship between generations. It was about the assumption that newer is better, that youth is superior, that the old ways are obsolete. And it was about the quiet, devastating proof that some things, some skills, some kinds of knowledge, only get deeper with time. The awards were given. Arthur accepted his first-place certificate and a gift card to a local sporting goods store, with the same unhurried grace he'd shown all day. Derek Michaels took second. Kyle Tanner finished fifth. As the crowd dispersed and shooters loaded their trucks and cleaned up their staging areas, Arthur sat at his bench one last time and field-stripped the M1 Carbine. He cleaned it the way he always cleaned it, methodically and completely, the way his father had taught him, the way the army had reinforced, the way 62 years of practice had made as automatic as breathing. He wiped down the bolt. He brushed the chamber. He ran a patch through the bore. He oiled the moving parts with a small squeeze bottle of CLP that he kept in a pocket of the canvas bag. He reassembled the carbine, performed a function check, and placed it back in the bag. Paul Kreider found him just as he was zipping the bag closed. "Sergeant Major," Paul said, "I've been running this match for 5 years. I've been shooting competitively for 20, and I can say without reservation that what you did today is the single most impressive display of marksmanship I've ever witnessed in person." Arthur looked at him. "Thank you," he said. "It's a good match. Well run. Safe. Fair. You should be proud of it." "I'd like to invite you back next year," Paul said. "And if you'd be willing, I'd like to have you come out sometime before the match to do a clinic. A proper instructional session. An hour or two. Teach people what you taught them today, but in more depth. I think it would mean a lot to the shooters around here." Arthur considered this. He looked out across the range where the last of the competitors were packing up. The sun had moved past its zenith and was settling into the long golden afternoon light of a Pennsylvania spring. The hills beyond the range were green with new growth, and somewhere in the tree line a bird was calling. It was a beautiful place to shoot, a good place to teach. "I'll think about it," Arthur said. And then he smiled. Not a wide smile, not a grin. A quiet, private expression that came from somewhere deep inside and touched his face just enough to change the landscape of it. "My father would have liked this place," he said. "He would have liked knowing the carbine still works." Paul watched him walk to his truck, a 15-year-old Ford Ranger with nothing on it. No stickers, no declarations, no advertisements of identity. Just a truck. Just a man. Just a canvas bag with a rifle in it that was older than most of the people who'd watched it work that day. He got in, started the engine, and pulled out of the gravel lot with the same unhurried, deliberate efficiency that had defined everything he'd done since he arrived. The video that the Spectator had recorded on his phone was posted to YouTube that evening. It was titled 74-Year-Old Veteran Destroys Competition with WW2 Carbine, and within 48 hours it had over 2 million views. The comment section was a torrent of admiration, military acknowledgement, and the particular kind of enthusiastic disbelief that the internet reserves for moments when an underdog reveals himself to be something extraordinary. Veterans posted their own stories. Firearms instructors shared the video with their students. Kyle Tanner posted a comment himself. It said, "I was the guy who laughed at his rifle. I'm not laughing anymore. Sergeant Major Dillard taught me more in 15 minutes than I learned in 4 years of competition. Respect." It received 40,000 likes. Arthur Dillard drove home to Mechanicsburg that evening with the M1 Carbine in its bag on the passenger seat, and the windows down and the smell of fired cartridges still faintly on his hands. He pulled into his driveway, carried the bag inside, and placed the carbine in its spot in the gun safe, next to a framed photograph of a young man in airborne fatigues, standing in a muddy field somewhere in Belgium in the winter of 1944, holding the same rifle. He closed the safe. He sat down in his chair. He looked at the photograph for a long time, and he said quietly, to the empty room, and to the memory of a man who'd been gone for more than 40 years, "Still runs, Dad. Still runs just fine. Some things don't expire. Some things don't become obsolete. Some skills only deepen. Some weapons only grow more faithful. And some men carry inside them a lifetime of discipline, sacrifice and mastery that no amount of money, no amount of technology, and no amount of youthful confidence can replicate." Arthur Dillard didn't go to the Millbrook Regional Carbine Challenge to prove anything. He went because he loves to shoot. He went because his father taught him to shoot, and the army taught him to shoot, and 62 years of devotion to a single weapon had made him something that most people will never be. Not fast, not talented, complete, completely and utterly at one with his craft, in a way that transcends equipment and age and expectation, and speaks to something fundamental about what human beings are capable of when they dedicate themselves to a discipline over the course of an entire life. That is not a competition result. That is a legacy. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people in your life who carry hidden depth and deserve more than a passing glance, then subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories because they matter. Because in a world that worships what's new, we believe that what endures is what defines us. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And the next time you see an old man with a worn-out rifle or a faded jacket or hands that have known decades of work, remember Arthur Dillard. Remember what he did with 62 years and 15 rounds. And remember that respect isn't given because of what someone carries, it's earned by who they are.